1983 was a stellar year for Islamic art on the Bosphorus and on the Gulf. 1983 saw a panoply of exhibitions in Istanbul under the rubric Anatolian civilizations. And in the autumn of that year, Poland, Austria, and Germany held a huge number of exhibitions relating to the siege of Vienna in particular, and European relations with the Ottomans in general. But the year began with the most remarkable event. That was the opening of the National Museum of Kuwait and, of course, the unveiling of the al-Sabah collection. And it's that revelatory moment that we celebrate now. I mention the other events for two reasons. First, the exhibitions in Turkey were almost entirely drawn from public collections. I remember sitting with my great friend Ünsal Yücel on a low wall just outside Ayasofya Jami, talking about how the exhibitions had actually created a surge of interest in the Ottoman period and a surge in collecting. There were, of course, pioneers in Turkey, and the Sadberk Hanım Museum had actually opened in 1980. But its scope was really Anatolian and Ottoman. In terms of a private collection that was comprehensive, chronologically and geographically, in the way it looked at the arts of Islam, the al-Sabah collection was a pioneer, not just in the Middle East, but anywhere. The second reason for mentioning the other events was to remind you of the turmoil in other parts of the world. I think some of us here can remember the exhibitions and conferences in Poland when there was literally nothing in the shops. I remember one shop opposite the hotel where the only thing they sold were brown carrots. And they weren't heritage carrots. So our Turkish colleagues came en masse in several coaches, accompanied by chefs. The hold of one of the coaches was full of edibles, aubergines, tomatoes, peppers, sumac, you name it. Everything you could not get in Poland at the time, everything that allowed the Turks to host wonderful banquets. Believe me, there was no such shortage in Kuwait. For Kuwait, at the opening of this exhibition, seemed a world oblivious of the chaos elsewhere. Though sadly, that was to be shattered a decade later with the invasion of Kuwait. So let me begin with my memories of that Kuwait journey. On the 22nd of February, arriving at Heathrow and finding a whole host of colleagues and friends from the world of Islamic art in the UK. They kept coming, as if drawn by a Pied Piper. I remember the sense of excitement. This was no ordinary museum opening. What munificence that so many people were invited. And the first evening we were all invited to a banquet in one of the 5 buildings of the Kuwait National Museum. The buildings didn't look quite as unloved then as they do in this photograph, but there was the imprint of the rather charmless modernism of the architect Michel Ecochard, and a building started only in 1981. But next morning we gathered for the opening, and we waited for some time in the courtyard as young ladies brought round dates and incense. Now, I remember the wait was rather long as we needed the dignitaries to make their tour. But for me, the time passed quickly as I recall falling into deep conversation with our next speaker, Suren Melikian. Sadly, though, Suren, I can't remember a word of what we talked about, just that it was intense and fraternal. And then we entered. And I'm sure I speak here for everyone. We were astounded. This was a huge display over many rooms of some 1,000 objects. It aimed at covering every period, every place. But at no point was the desire for inclusion allowed to compromise quality. Now, Sheikh Nasser only began collecting, I'm told, in 1973. Perhaps his first purchase wasn't that auspicious. His first acquisition, so Katie tells me, was an Iranian figurative carpet depicting Cyrus the Great. And Jassim Homezi kindly took him aside and said, "Let me show you what a real carpet looks like." But after that, Sheikh Nasser never looked back. Now, the remarkable thing here is that Sheikh Nasser was only asked to contribute to the National Museum in June of 1982, leaving a mere 8 months to do everything, including a catalogue. Yet nothing betrayed the haste. Of course, Sheikh Nasser had a battalion up all night, including Katie, polishing the cases, and there were the odd glitches. The alarms in the cases had been placed on such a sensitive setting that when the Emir was given his royal tour, the alarm in every case was set off by the plentiful gold on his robes and his person. It was an unintended chorus of alarms. Now, going into the galleries, I was immediately struck by the structure, the arrangement of the rooms. They recalled the Met galleries that had opened in 1971, where Richard Ettinghausen had in turn been influenced by the structure of the galleries in Berlin. There were early centuries, quite dense in display of cases and objects. I'm sorry that I only have a few slides. And then the later rooms, if you like, the gunpowder empires, opened up into capacious rooms where greater use was made of the walls. There were other echoes of the Met display. In almost every room, there were objects of great size, many architectural. While in later rooms, the walls had not only architectural items, but were festooned with great carpets, creating a sense of grandeur against which the objects were set. And in the cases, there was an echo of the Met displays with objects on multiple levels. And there were wonderful juxtapositions where the combination of objects was greater than the sum of its parts. I remember particularly well a Fatimid luster fragment next to a fragment of an unglazed jar, next to an intact luster jar. Here, exactly as Ollie has just told us, was a collector who was clearly not put off by the fragmentary nature of an object, but who could see in its partial state its poignant beauty. The juxtapositions encourage us to look long. And the extraordinary view as one came off one of those strange raised walkways that Echo Shah liked, as one moved between the pavilions onto a gallery area and looked down at the gigantic Moroccan 14th century doors that were so sadly torched during the invasion of Kuwait. This was theatre. And then, of course, there was the monumental garden carpet. So there were single objects that encouraged us to look long. Many of these features then reminded me of the Met displays and even of the juxtapositions that you saw in the LA Maya Museum in Jerusalem, again, where Richard Ettinghausen's hand was deeply felt. This wasn't an illusion, for there was a Met and Ettinghausen connection through Lynn Jenkins and Manuel Keane. However, let's be clear, I am not citing these Met connections in any condescending way. Remember that this was before most of the major collections of Islamic art had gone for redisplays. So here we were faced with a compendious collection structured in a tested manner with a sense of historical vista. All of it touched with lightness and with an eye for the interesting. And what a collection. It's utterly astonishing that it had been formed in only 10 years. An astounding feat from that Cyrus the Great carpet to what we saw here. And as we went round, there was a sense, as one viewed masterpiece after masterpiece, of seeing some familiar friends, even if one didn't always recall where you knew them from. So take the Hunt Oliphant on the left. Yes, it had been published by Colonel in 1971, but my goodness, was it wonderful to see it. Now, many objects like this Oliphant were acquired singly, but Sheikh Nasser negotiated a major coup. The collection of Martine Marie-Paul de Béarn, Comtesse de Béarn, who died in 1939, a famously eccentric lady who was a remarkable collector across almost every field. Just look at the collections in the Getty, for example, her remarkable Titian, or perhaps the most striking of all Greek vases. So we saw here objects maybe familiar to you from Gaston Migeon's Manuel d'Art Musulman, the rock crystal chess pieces, or the Spanish ivories. There were other less well-published items from the Comtesse de Béarn's collection, almost 100 of them. So here was a collection that was at the forefront of the display of Islamic art and that was encyclopedic, replete with masterpieces, animated by intriguing fragments. We were all excited at being privileged to be among the first to see the collection's breadth and brilliance. The we included scholars, and it's interesting that there is not a single picture of a scholar, dealers, eminent dealers, collectors, and of course, Maharajas. This was a hubbub of hobnobs. But it's interesting to see not just the glamour, but the wonderful relationship here between Sheikh Nasser and Babci. I wasn't the only one excited, and one day was for the opening, as I just described. But the next day, many of us were let into the museum, and I recall at least one impromptu seminar. I sort of lingered behind, but then came into the Mogul room to see Robert Skelton, surrounded by scholars as he discussed the Mogul seated scribe, which he'd had taken out of the case. I can think of no greater testimony to the collection than to have a gaggle of experts hanging on Robert's words and arguing over the finer points of just one out of 1,000 works of art. Sheikh Nasser, Sheikh Hossa, I can't praise you enough for your achievement. Thank you.